Hello and welcome back to the Christian Century YouTube channel. I'm John, and I'm joined today by one of our writers, Raúl Zegarra, who has written a piece, a tribute piece, to Gustavo Gutiérrez, often called the father of liberation theology, who passed away recently. So we're going to be chatting about that article and about Gutierrez. But first, Raúl, welcome. Can you tell our listeners a little bit more about who you are?
Thank you. Thank you, John, for the invite. I'm Raúl Zegarra, from Peru. I'm a professor of Roman Catholic Studies at Harvard Divinity School, and I work on questions of social justice, faith, and politics.
That's great. Thanks for joining us.
Mhm.
In the beginning of your article, you tell us about your very first meeting and conversation with Gustavo Gutierrez, and at the end of the article, you tell us about your final conversation with him. I wonder if you could connect some of the dots in between those two conversations and tell us about what your relationship was like with him over the years.
Sure, sure. Thank you for asking. Look, I met Gutierrez back in Peru. Gutierrez is also from Peru. We met because there were common circles. Gutierrez was a professor for many years at the Catholic University, where I went for college and also was a professor there for some time. And we met through I remember there was a theologian, a friend of Gutierrez, very close to the Liberation Theology Circle. Um, Her son actually noticed that I was reading avidly Gutierrez's work. And he said, this guy is still around, and I can probably, connect you to the classes of theology they teach every now and then. They had like this kind of, I mentioned this in the piece, sort of summer and winter courses. So that was the beginning of it. And through that, I was a college philosophy major. I did philosophy, but started having this kind of curiosity for theological studies. And through reading his work and then meeting Gutierrez, that became more of a vocation. Then I went to University of Notre Dame for a master's, and Gutierrez was a professor there. So there actually was where we developed the thickness of our relationship. We will have lunch very often, chat about politics, theology, or just ordinary life. And Gutierrez was this kind of very caring. I mentioned also this in the piece, like very kind of human touch contact kind of person. Yeah, we discussed theoretical matters and all that, but overall was like this kind of attentiveness to the everyday, and that relationship grew beautifully. Then I went to University of Chicago for my PhD, but we remain in touch constantly. When I will be in Peru, I'll go visit. Sometimes he will come to visit to my house. So it was a really friendly, warm relationship, but also just this kind of beautiful mentoring of this great theologian that was just also an ordinary man who cared about you.
Oh, that's lovely. Thanks for sharing that, Raul. There's a funny kind of idea in the piece. You mentioned that from time to time, people will claim that liberation theology is dead, and that Gutierrez would often joke, like, "Why wasn't I invited to the funeral?" And you say that far from being dead, over the last 50 years, liberation theology has continued to grow and develop. And you mentioned a few of the ways in the article that growth has occurred, but I wonder if you could just tell us a little more of your thoughts on kind of the trajectories of liberation theology over the last 5 decades.
Sure. I would say that there is some obvious ways, some of which are mentioned in the piece, and some are not so obvious. Maybe I'll focus a little bit on those. I think that it is very clear that the first generation of liberation theologians, especially in Latin America, were very focused on the question of poverty, material poverty, this kind of severe need, people just not having enough income to, cover the basics. And that was really important, especially in the 60s and 70s. But quickly, this always important issue became enriched, I would say, with other perceptions of injustice and vulnerability, right? Quickly, you have the development of feminist liberation theologians, both in Latin America and in the globe, that start, pressing liberation theologians, most of whom in Latin America were priests and, of course, male, that there is a whole area of, vulnerability and oppression that is not really taken care of in some of the work of these theologians. So that becomes one very important issue that Gutierrez and others really incorporate quickly in the way they thought about oppression. But soon after, you have other kinds of things, race, you have questions of, sexual orientation, queer theology emerges over time, not without tension, by the way. But there is a sense, I always speak about the kind of uh, um, expansive nature of the concept of liberation. And I think that was from the beginning there, but there is also a sense in which history expands the sense of what is unjust, a kind of more subtle, richer perception of injustice. But also wanted to, and of course, maybe I should add the question of the environment that also is not immediately the most important one, but has become clearly an issue with climate change and something where liberation theologians have been working, I would say at this point for several decades. But I also want to focus on some trajectories that are not so obvious. One of the things that people sometimes don't account for is that liberation theology in Latin America, at least, was mainly a Catholic movement that experienced a lot of backlash, quickly from the Catholic Church, which meant that from the Vatican to bishops and many different ways, many of the things that liberation theologians were building, in terms of infrastructure, consciousness raising and different kind of things of the liberation theology movement were really, kind of erased very intentionally in the 80s and 90s and on. And that meant that many people working for liberation from the perspective of their faith had to find other venues, other spaces to, work for liberation. And that meant that many people had to work, beyond or outside, the context of the Catholic Church to keep working for that Catholic Christian sense of liberation in a Catholic Church that was more and more hostile and less welcoming. So that's also something that has permeated a lot of different movements of liberation, some of which remain religious and Christian in nature, but others that are not necessarily like that, but in part are connected to this kind of movement from the church to other spaces to keep working for, liberation and against oppression.
Wow, thank you. It's helpful. The final thing I wanted to ask you about at the end of the essay, it's a pretty touching scene. You talk just briefly about your final conversation with
Mm,
Gutierrez, and you tell him that his life has transformed your life. And I just can't help but think about when I think about transformation, can't help but think about the moment that we're in right now. This may not go onto YouTube until a little bit later, but as we sit here recording this conversation, it is just after the 2024 US presidential election. As you navigate a moment like this and all that's happening, how does this transformation brought to your life through Gutierrez and his work, how does that impact the way you think about and live in this kind of moment?
thank you. And you're right. It's a very momentous day that we decided to record. Um, there are several ways, maybe. The first thing I would say, and I already mentioned some of these, is just this kind of personal, very close human touch, right? That I think that was one of the things that really became transformative because it allowed me to see, you know, humanity, I think, in its complexity with the different, pulls and directions that sometimes we go, and also our contradictions and uh, also this sense of not thinking about people who may experience poverty or vulnerability as a monolith, the people that always choose in the same way. And I think that's obvious in this 2024 election, that many things were anticipated, will go in certain ways. And that has, I think, all bit to do with certain expectations about how certain ethnic, social groups will vote, and things didn't go that way. And I think that's telling us something that is, I think, very important for liberation theology, regardless if you are from Democratic or Republican Party. That is that there is this sense in the country that things have to change. This perception that there is some kind of established group, we call it establishment, that is running things for a long time and people don't experience change. I'm not trying to say that the parties are equal. I don't believe so at all. But I think there is this sense, and that just tells you something about this constant need to think about how ordinary people live life and what their actual concerns are. And I think that that's something that was very important for liberation theology and for Gutierrez, who would always say, by the way, when talking about this idea of a preferential option for the poor, the idea that both, divine love, but also human love should, be attentive to the needs of the poor, especially, that this was not because poor people or people who experience marginalization or vulnerability are good people all the time or necessarily. It's just because poverty, homophobia, misogyny, the destruction of the planet are bad things, and one should work to oppose them. That does not mean that people are going to always go the way you think they're going to go, right? And I think there's something powerful in that lesson about the preferential option for the poor, perhaps, to think about what happened with this election, how dissatisfied many people are, to avoid just going into a strong emotional reaction that just thinks people are making stupid choices and they don't know what they do and they don't know what they choose, and instead have a richer understanding of how moral action takes place, the many, many vectors that are in place, and also the deep sense of dissatisfaction that many, many people feel. And that is an invitation, I think, to transform social structures and dynamics in a way that seems very aligned with liberation theology, even if the outcome of the election is not exactly what one may want.
Wow, thank you. So much to think about. Um, Anyone out there who didn't get a chance to read Raul's article about Gustavo Gutierrez, the link to that article will be in the video description below, along with the link to Raul's personal website where you can find information about his books, his other writings. Thank you so much for chatting today, Raul.
Thank you.